Okay, so it's been quite a long time since I last made a video about Rome Total War, but I'm breaking that streak today for a very good reason, which is that at the time of recording there has just been a new release of the mod Rome Total Realism Imperium Surrectum, and for those who don't know, that is kind of the leading mod for the remastered version of Rome Total War. So in this video I'm going to be going over some of the kind of key things you need to know about the mod, and kind of showing off the thing that I think is particularly impressive about it, and the thing that really shows off just how ambitious it is, which is the size of its campaign map. So there is quite a lot to cover, and I don't quite know where to begin, but I think the obvious place to start is with that campaign map. So going back to the release of Rome Total War Remastered, one of the kind of key selling points of that game was that mods would have a lifted cap on various things like the number of factions, the number of settlements, the number of units, and so on. And those limits were initially actually quite significant, to the point where the remastered version of the game in its mods is able to do things that the previous version of the game simply could not do. And that's part of the story of why this mod even exists, because there were two previous mods for the original Rome, namely Rome Total Realism, which is a mod significant enough to have its own Wikipedia page, and Roma Surrectum, which was another extremely popular overhaul mod. And those two teams came together in order to create, for the remastered version of the game, Imperium Surrectum, which is what we're seeing here. And as you can probably tell, the scale of this campaign map is absolutely unlike anything we've ever seen, certainly in any Rome Total War mod, but also probably in just any Total War mod ever. So the team actually put up a comparison of the size of the original campaign map compared to the size of this campaign map, and as you can see, there is just no comparison. This mod is not only far more zoomed in and far more detailed, but it also covers a much larger area of the world. So the original campaign map, of course, only really extended to the kind of western edge of Parthia, and had a kind of much reduced version of the Seleucid Empire. This version of the map, the Seleucid Empire, starts off with 91 provinces, and that's more provinces than you need to complete the original campaign. The original campaign, I have done a couple of playthroughs on the channel, and you can see that you do only need 50 provinces, and by the time you've taken over 50 provinces, you've pretty much taken over the whole of Europe. The other comparison they showed off is with the other very popular mod map called Mundus Magnus, which I think was used on previous versions of this mod. And Mundus Magnus was similar to this in terms of the amount of the world that it covered. It covered everything from the kind of western edge of Ireland, all the way across to India, including the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, but it was also quite zoomed out in terms of its scale. There were far fewer settlements, the lands themselves appeared far smaller. So this mod map really combines a couple of different philosophies, really. Not only is it trying to cover an absolutely huge area, all the way from Ireland to India, and all the way down, in fact, to the Horn of Africa, but also the countries themselves, the regions themselves, are incredibly detailed, with a huge number of settlements. In fact, there are over 900 settlements on this map, and they're all researched. They're all real places that existed, pretty much. And this mod does have historians as part of its team, really helping to kind of flesh things out and add a bit of historical accuracy to it. And the mod is very much still in development too, so there's still a lot more that can be added to this. And the idea of this is just to be a kind of definitive version of Rome Total War, with a lot more depth, more historical accuracy, and more breadth as well. So at the time of recording, the most recent release of the game not only had over 900 settlements, but also has around 50 playable factions, a huge number of new custom units with more to be added, additional mechanics added in, like for example the religion mechanic from the Barbarian Invasion expansion has been added in this, although in this case the idea isn't that you need to control religion, but that you need to control culture instead. So there are 22 different cultures that have been added into the game. And the main idea of culture is really just to stop you from being able to expand as quickly as you could in the original game. You do have to first control culture in order to prevent your people from rebelling against you, and doing that can be very expensive. Similarly, once you take over a new province, there are some new mechanics, so you need to actually colonize the province, which effectively involves building a new building, which is very expensive, takes quite a while to build, and only once that building is complete are you able to start recruiting from your newly conquered settlements. So the philosophy of the mod is very clearly to be a much more expanded and extended experience, and another way that kind of manifests itself in the mod is upkeep costs in this mod are extremely expensive. So in the original game, there's not really too much stopping you from having massive forces, But in this mod, upkeep is often very similar, less but very similar to the actual recruitment cost of new units. So in effect you have much smaller forces, and even if you can make good use of those, you still have to keep a lot of money in reserve to actually colonize places, to adapt them to your culture, and so on. Other ways this mod adds a bit of extra challenge. The AI does get a bit of financial assistance for free, which is not entirely fair on the player, and I think some players might not like that kind of feature. But at the same time, I think it does ensure that AI players can be at least kind of competitive. Rebel provinces are also more difficult to take over. One of the features is that if you besiege certain cities, rebel or not, it can be given extra units in its garrison just to help fend you off. And rebels in this game, which are called the Free Peoples, are at least supposed to be smart enough to be able to actually attack you, unlike in the original game where they're just kind of extremely passive. Another feature that makes this game more challenging is that you do start off with, typically for most factions, you do start off with negative income. So you do start off with a kind of decent starting treasury, which you can build a few things with, but typically you're going to be going into debt by turn 2 or turn 3, so you need to make sure you really make the best of your start. What the developers recommend is that you take your starting forces and go to conquer extra towns, which will of course give you a bit of an economic boost, as well as actually killing off some of your units, which might not be a bad thing, since they do cost so much in upkeep. In my experience, just from the kind of brief campaigns I've tried doing, it's not really that difficult to get yourself back into profit, so I wouldn't recommend being too put off by that. It is just one small extra obstacle you do have to overcome at the start of the campaign. Something else to mention is that the developers do recommend playing this on hard battle difficulty and hard campaign difficulty. I did try playing on very hard instead, and while I do think it would add some extra challenge, and I do think this mod in its current form does still suffer a little bit from kind of the same thing as the original Rome, where I think you can reach a point where you do just get unstoppable momentum. I did find that playing on very hard battle difficulty was very punishing. It's not such a problem in the original Rome because it's fairly easy to reach a point where you're only taking battles if you have a much larger force. But in this mod, you're at least going to be kind of matched by the AI in a lot of cases. So you're going to be facing those situations where, for example, when I tried it, I had a unit of spearmen which I sent in to attack a skirmisher unit, which is a ranged unit, and my spearmen got beaten by what should have been the kind of specialist ranged unit. And you do get situations like that if you play on very hard difficulty, where you will just find yourself taking fights which should really be in your favor, but they'll just end up going against you instead. It's pretty good for the extra challenge, but I do think it's not really going to appeal to everyone, and I would recommend sticking with the mod developer's recommendation, which is hard battle difficulty, and probably hard campaign difficulty as well, although I think if you're going to raise one up to very hard, I would go with campaign difficulty first. To address a bit of an elephant in the room, I think obviously it has to be acknowledged that for a lot of players, this is not going to be the kind of thing that appeals to them because it's probably just a bit too extreme. However, I think you do need to look at this mod in a different way. The idea of this mod is not to sweep over the whole of Europe. The long campaign typically requires you to take 100 settlements, and obviously on a campaign map with over 900 settlements, you're probably only really going to take over the equivalent of 2 or 3 countries. If you did decide to do a conquest of this whole map, I imagine it would get pretty tedious, and it would also probably take you hundreds of hours in real life. But for a very small minority of players, that might be exactly what they're looking for. If you're not in that minority of players, I think you can still enjoy this if you just accept the fact you're not going to take over the whole of the continent. But I think for the majority of players, it is genuinely quite immersive to not just take over an entire country by taking over 1 or 2 settlements. So yeah, if you do decide to get into this, do expect quite a lengthy and drawn-out campaign. To address another elephant in the room, this mod obviously does have higher performance requirements than the original game as well. The big one is that the mod really does take up quite a lot of space in your hard drive. So for example, this version of the game that I'm currently showing does take a total of 40 gigabytes, which is obviously pretty massive for a mod. But at the same time, I think it's pretty understandable given the sheer scale and ambition of it. I did personally decide to install this on an HDD instead of on an SSD, and for what it's worth, I haven't experienced any particular issues in terms of the time taken to load up the campaign map. I also haven't really noticed any massively problematic lag spikes. I definitely have had a bit of lag when I first load up a battle, for example, or sometimes when I move one of my characters across the map, but typically I only really get a few seconds of reduced performance, usually just right at the very start of a battle, and after that it's completely fine. I also did find the fog of war to be just a little bit too impenetrable, but I don't know if that's down to the exact settings I'm using, or possibly that's just the way it's intended. Something I did see recommended is that you shouldn't Alt-Tab out of the game and then go back into it because it can kind of mess with the visuals a bit. Although from what I've seen on my personal computer, it doesn't really make too much of a difference either way. Also, something else to mention about the philosophy of the mod is that given that you will be expanding much more slowly across the continent itself, there is a risk that it does become a bit too samey, and that's because if you're playing as, for example, the faction in Britain right now, there's really just one faction in Britain, and you're going to be completely surrounded by other barbarians. So it's entirely possible that you could take over 100 settlements and still just be stuck fighting pretty much just barbarians the entire time. But like a lot of mods, this mod does really flesh out barbarians a lot more. So they're a lot less pathetic, there's a lot more you can build in their towns, for example. There's a lot more diversity in terms of their unit rosters. And I think they are going to add a lot more diversity as well as they continue to develop the mod. A personal recommendation from me, if you are going to try and play this, is to have a quick look at the custom battle screen and to actually kind of check what your chosen faction has currently available, because in this version of the mod, some factions are definitely more fleshed out than others. So there are certain factions where I think you're probably better off waiting before you play them, just to make sure they actually are interesting enough to carry you through conquering 100 settlements. If you do want to play to the end of a long campaign, that is. I also find the graphics are completely fine on my graphics card, which is a GTX 780. So at the time of recording, that's already a 9-year-old graphics card. So you're probably going to be fine with just about any modern graphics card. My processor is a lot better, it's a Ryzen 5800X. So I can't speak for slower processors, but I did find that the actual end turns are also not that slow, considering there are 50 different factions and an absolutely massive campaign map to process the end turn on. But obviously a lot of people will have different experiences depending on their individual setup, and I would recommend, of course, if you're having trouble installing this, do check in on the official Discord for this mod. By the way, I will leave links in the description to things like where you can buy Rome Remastered, where you can get the mod, and so on. Something else you should also do to make sure that the game performs correctly is you need to go onto your visual settings, and you need to make sure your unit color scheme is set to realistic instead of vibrant. If you don't do that, you're going to see all the unit cards in the game as just kind of neutral, grayed out peasants, which is kind of like the placeholder unit card. The mod also has a custom soundtrack, which I'm not sure I can really show off because I'm not sure what the copyright situation is, but obviously that's not going to be relevant to the vast majority of players. So for the vast majority of players, there are quite a few more tracks that you can listen to as you play the game, and I think most of them are of pretty good quality, and also just give you a bit more variety to listen to in the background, which I think is probably quite important if you're playing a really long campaign. Future versions of the mod are going to be a lot more developed in terms of economy. The current version really just recommends that you start off with farming, and as you progress through the game, you start to move more towards income based on trade. But future versions of the mod are intended to flesh out the economic side a lot more, and I personally didn't find this too difficult to pick up and start playing, but I expect there are going to be features added as time goes by, which will create a little bit of a learning curve. Similarly, you do need to pay a lot more attention to things like your generals and your family members, because the traits of those family members and generals are going to have a much bigger impact compared to the vanilla version of the game. But yeah, that's a brief overview of Rome Total Realism Imperium Surrectum. Very much the kind of leading light of all the mods for Remastered version right now. Definitely worth checking out, and definitely worth following the development of the mod. I would absolutely love to do a full playthrough of this mod campaign on this channel one day, but I imagine 100 settlements would take an extremely long time to get done, so I'm not sure when or if that will happen. But I am hoping to expand my channel into more of this type of thing, so do let me know if you're interested in seeing more. But yeah, that is going to be all for now. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you found it interesting. Do subscribe if you'd like to see more from me, and do go check out the mod Steam page to see the latest updates. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.